God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God? That's Micah 6:8. Sounds simple, right? Maybe not easy, but certainly simple. What does the Lord require of you? Justice, kindness, humility. We can all agree that these are the hallmarks of a faithful life. But what do we mean when we say do justice? And how exactly do you love kindness? And for that matter, you wouldn't think we could disagree, but how do we actually walk humbly with our God? Sometimes, sometimes we do disagree. The truth is that it is difficult to live in America right now and to vehemently disagree with one another on things that we consider to be fundamental truths. We wonder, how can this person whom I love, this person whom I know to be loving and faithful and kind, how can we disagree so intensely about things that seem to be fundamental truth? I want to speak to that today because this is something that you all have been asking me about, and it's something that I have been looking into and studying. And I learned about these 6 moral frameworks. This is from Jonathan Haidt. This is from his book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And I learned about it from the Reverend Dr. Leah Shade, who is a professor of preaching and worship at Lexington Theological Seminary. And Haidt says that we all are operating out of these 6 moral frameworks. The first one is care versus harm, which means that an action is good if it cares for others and it is bad if it harms others. This sounds simple, and this is one of the frameworks that we see most often in the Bible. I think perhaps because people in the Bible were so often living on the edge of life and death, they needed each other. If they didn't care for someone who was hurt or vulnerable, if they didn't care for the widow and the orphan, if they didn't care for the stranger or the immigrant, then that person may die. And in fact, when they are in that situation, they might be at risk of death. And so living right there on the edge of life and death, there is a real ethic of care woven throughout the Bible. Dr. Shade says this is the one we see most often in the Bible, and I agree. And again, this seems simple, but the truth is people may disagree about who is the most vulnerable and who in any given situation is the one that needs care. The second framework is fairness versus cheating. This is a really justice-based framework. It emphasizes what is fair and equal for all. But we all know that people may disagree on what is fair and what is truly just. The third framework is liberty versus oppression. And again, of course, we see this in the Bible through the threads of Moses and the people becoming free. We also hear Paul tell us, for freedom Christ has set you free. The truth is that all people want to feel free to live and to make their own decisions about their lives. This seems simple and true and clear and easy, but people may disagree about what is needed for people to truly be free. And we can come into conflict when one person's freedom impinges upon or maybe oppresses or creates less freedom for another person. The fourth framework is loyalty versus betrayal, and this prioritizes loyalty to a team, a country, a community, or another group. But we all know that we can have differing and competing loyalties. Any working mother can tell you that the loyalty to our commitment to our vocation and our job can come into conflict with our commitment to our family, our children, our vocations. It's just one of the many ways that we all deal with competing loyalties in our lives. The fifth framework is authority versus subversion. This prioritizes order and following the rules and deferring to authority. But what happens when a rule or an order or a law is unjust? What happens when our loyalty to the law or to order comes into conflict with our loyalty, say, to God or to our Christian faith or to one of these other moral frameworks? This is and can be a problem. The sixth moral framework is sanctity versus degradation, and this focuses on protecting or restoring things that are seen as sacred and pure. Sometimes these things are fragile, but they are seen as vital and important. But of course, people may disagree on what is truly sacrosanct. Let me give you an example of how this all can work in a situation. In my first call, I served a church that was located in the middle of a neighborhood. And one night, we had a young man in that neighborhood who was not in his right mind. He was having a very, very, very bad night. And what happened is he found himself running through the neighborhood, unclothed and in need of help. He knew he needed help, and he had enough sense not to ring a doorbell or knock on someone's door or break into a home in that state, but he saw the church and he said, "There's somewhere I can get help." So, of course, he ran up to the church, which was locked, and he broke the glass door to get in. Once he got into the church, he wanted to call 911 for help. And while there were some phones that were not behind doors, again, locked doors, again, he was not in his right mind. And so he went looking for the first phone that he could see, which happened to be through the window into my office. And so he broke the window and broke into my office, got into my office, and used that phone to call 911. Help did arrive, not only ambulances, but also the police, which made him even more alone and afraid. And so he ended up barricading himself into my office for some time. He was alone, he was afraid, he was bleeding, and he wouldn't let anyone in to help. Well, eventually, they were able to talk him down. They were able to get into the office, and he came out of my office wrapped in my preaching robe, hung with a cross-stitch stole that was handmade in Jerusalem. Once he got to the hospital, all of that ended up in a biohazard bin, and he ended up eventually in treatment. Now, an ethic of care literally says, clothe the naked. It says this young man was very scared and not really sane. And he saw a church and he said, "Good, that's somewhere I can get help." And as hard as this was for me personally, I am so glad that he did what he did. We as a congregation didn't press charges, but we did make sure that he got help. He got treatment because he needed this care. If we look at this through the lens of fairness versus cheating, or even authority versus subversion, he did break the law. If we look at it through the lens of liberty versus oppression, the truth is we didn't press charges, but I'm pretty sure the treatment that he received was legally required for his own safety as well as others. There were some competing loyalties at play, at least for me pastorally. My loyalty to keep the church and the congregation safe, my commitment to care for the vulnerable, my loyalty to my own calling, and of course, in the end, my loyalty to Christ. And as Christ says, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, heal the sick, welcome the stranger, visit those in prison. Christ says, love your neighbor as yourself. But I think the moral framework that was probably most difficult for me is that of sanctity versus degradation. I struggled personally with this because my office had a lot of my own personal effects in there. I wouldn't say that it was desecrated, that's too harsh, but it certainly was transgressed. After this young man left the church, called in crime scene cleaners who cleaned everything in my office that had blood on it. Anything that was fabric or was ripped out was taken away. And so by the time I got in my office that afternoon, there was no carpet, no rugs, no couch. My desk was gone. A lot of things from my closet. I told you about my preaching robe, which was a gift from my parents. I had an alb, which was a gift from my home congregation. Several precious stoles that were gifted to me. There were toys that belonged to my children, and there were pictures of them that were gone. And I knew they were gone because they had blood on them, because they had been touched and held by this man in his time of need, but they had to be removed. And the truth is that was difficult for me. It was heartbreaking for him, but it was also disconcerting for me personally. Now the case is for me and for our church. To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with our God meant care, meant treatment. We reached out to his family. We made a claim on our insurance, and I bought a new robe. All is well. But it's not always so simple. I tend to believe that most of us default to an ethic of care when something is immediate, is personal, when we're face to face with another person, when we see a hungry child or a hungry adult, and we have a way to change that, we're going to do that. If we see someone who is hurt, even if it's their own fault, we are going to try and help. But the further removed we are when it's on TV or when we read about it in the news, and especially when it's on social media, we tend to get righteous. And that's not all bad. Having principles is important. But I do think it's something to note, because when we interact with one another face to face, having compassion and care, empathy, even being willing to listen to each other and to share our minds, to speak the truth in love, to care for and to protect a person in need, it is second nature. It is who we are. But the more removed we are, that can get difficult. And so I want us to remember the next time we disagree with a neighbor whom we love, take a minute to think not only about their moral framework, but also about our own. Because being clear on our own reasons to act, to speak, to bear witness is absolutely vital to doing justice with integrity. And any one of these frameworks can be good and true, and most of us use all of these in different situations. The truth is, we may still disagree with our neighbor, even if we understand the framework which they are operating from. And you may find their moral framework problematic, even wrong. But understanding a little bit about all of this may help us stay in relationship. And relationships are vital to healing, to empathy, to transformation of the whole world. Not everyone is called to do this work of staying in relationship and being in conversation with others whose moral frameworks conflict with our own. That is okay. We all have our own important roles to play. But all of us are called to love our neighbors and to be faithful to that calling, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. Amen.